Welcome back to another edition of the Saturday to Sunday Football Podcast. I am Paul Perticchese. Happy New Year to all our listeners. So excited to be back on the airwaves and even more excited to be rejoined by my right-hand man, Mr. Jeff Abercrombie. Jeff, happy holidays, happy New Year. Excited to see you across the way with me tonight.
Yeah, I've really missed it, man. Missed you. You have been carrying the torch across the finish line. We're off the fantasy season at least. We are one game away from the end of the college football season. So, thank you for getting us to here because this is
It's
where
draft
the
season.
exciting part starts. Yeah, this is
It
the
is
exciting
draft
part.
season. I think I may have lost Jeff for 1 second there. So it is draft season. The playoffs are now in the books. The championship game is set for next Monday night. And we're going to break it down tonight. Everything we saw in those two big semifinal playoff games. So we're going to talk a little bit about some more people who've entered the transfer portal, where they're going, some undetermined yet. Talk about some early entrants, all things college football, all things NFL draft tonight. Next week, we'll obviously recap national championship game. We'll kind of spin it to a final NFL rookie report for the year before we turn all our attention to the pre-draft circuit, the Senior Bowl, the Shrine Bowl, and then obviously all the combine and stuff after that. But it's almost fully pre-draft season, but we're not there just yet. So, Jeff, let's talk about what we saw New Year's Day, those two classic games, Michigan beating Alabama in overtime 27-20, Washington outlasting Texas 37-31. I actually shut off the TV after the onside kick because I had to be up at 5 a.m. I didn't know anything that happened. I didn't even realize that they still had enough timeouts to get the ball back. I almost woke up to Texas stunning me, and I would have thought it was like literally a joke that if I saw that Texas had won that game because I literally shut my TV off after the onside kick. But the story we got to start with is Michael Penix Jr. We were talking a little bit off air, yesterday and stuff. 29 of 38, 430 yards, 2 touchdowns, 31 yards rushing, showing an ability, and you phrased it best. This was his CJ Stroud game last year when CJ Stroud showed more in his repertoire versus Georgia than we had ever seen. That was Michael Penix Jr. the other night against Texas, adding that 31 yards rushing, but also, playing off structure a little bit more than we were used to. So let me give you the floor to kind of just talk a little bit about what you saw about Michael Penix Jr. the other night that has you so excited. We finally, I think, are starting to see people say round one. It's about time. Most of the year, I thought he's been my QB4. I didn't know why he was so far down, ranks and looked at. But where do you want to start with Michael Penix Jr.?
Yeah, and hopefully my internet doesn't cut out again here, but honestly, it's not anything I saw last night. We did talk about his CJ Stroud moment, and I think we'll get in on that. But honestly, this was Michael Penix was playing this way all year. It's just that, the level of difficulty, the stage, and the degree and consistency to which he did it the other night was sort of the coalescence and like the pinnacle moment of all of that coming together, right? In on the biggest stage in the second biggest game now of his career. I mean, it's all we could do is we go back to a scouting report, right? The precision, accuracy, timing, by precision, like the ball placement, the touch, the anticipation. I mean, he was, people say like you're, on those long passes, you're dropping a dime in a bucket. Like, he was fitting that into thimble size windows. Like they were perfect passes. In great, ways that only his receivers could make those plays. And so I know we definitely have, the kind of arguments for, why we may not want to get over our skis excited here. But to me, I think the way that he played sort of makes all those arguments like, nitpicking moot points, because he showed it regardless of the talent across the field, regardless of the talent at wide receiver, regardless of, I think the only, regardless of his age, right? Like the only thing that I think might catch up to him when it comes draft season is the medicals, right? And we have no insight into that. And we won't know if his draft capital, if it was pick 15 or pick 32 or pick 50, if medicals played a role, or if it were some of these other things that the NFL is scared off about. And I think that's going to be the trickiest evaluation of Michael Penix Jr., in rookie season, going into the NFL and kind of setting expectations.
Yeah, I think listen, we've seen even from last year him putting up like arcade-like numbers, but this year we saw a lot more consistency. We saw him rise to the occasion in big spots. We were talking yesterday and just playing the other side of like, why would he not be a top 10, top 15, top 20? And like, there's not a lot to really put on that list anymore besides the medicals. I think you're going to have some people still talk about the quality of defenses he's faced. Texas is a good defense, but a poor secondary. So I still think you could hear that argument a little bit. I think he could put it all to bed versus Michigan. If he goes out there and puts on a performance even remotely close to what he did against Texas, I don't know. I think we all of a sudden have 4 quarterbacks going in the top 10, because I think somebody's going to fall in love, even with the medicals, to the point of top 10, top 12, and we're going to have 4 quarterbacks going there if he does this again against Michigan. Because then you got to wipe away he can't do it against better defenses. Yeah, he's got a pristine setup. He's got a great O-line, great wide receivers, really good play caller. He's got it all set up, but he's performing at such an elite level. And if he's doing it against good defenses, now Texas is probably the best defense they faced this year, but the secondary suspect. But now the Michigan stage, and if he keeps them in that game, and it's a barn burner, and he finds ways to score against Michigan, there's going to be a lot. It's going to be hard to say, if the medicals check out, why he isn't top 10 or top 15. I think you're starting to see some mock drafts that came right out since the New Year's Day games. You're starting to see him finally in round 1 mocks. That was non-existent before that game. He was in almost no mocks, and most people were pegging him as a round 2, some even round 3 territory as a quarterback, which was, which I felt was crazy, because I have been a fan. He's been higher than JJ McCarthy on my list. He's been higher than Bo Nix on my list. So he's a guy that I think really highly of. And I had some question marks. Seeing him play off structure a little bit the other day really even got me more excited in a conversation with you. And I think you made great points. Like, I said, like, he does as a distributor remind me a little bit of Tua, but you hit it on the head. And I went back before I wanted to do this podcast, and I watched a lot of the game again. Like, the arm talent is far superior than Tua. For me, it's more of like distributing the ball almost like a point guard. Like, he's got so many great weapons there at Washington, similar to how Tua had all those great weapons at Alabama, finding ways to kind of appease everybody, take his shots when they were there. I think he can throw with good touch and anticipation, but the natural arm talent is far superior to Michael Penix Jr. And now he's just checking off boxes that, like, if you're, a team like Atlanta, which is not going to be in the top 10 probably, right? Because they have a few too many wins, and he's sitting there. How would you not be intrigued with a guy like Michael Penix Jr.? Give him those weapons of Bijan and Drake London, and Kyle Pitts, and they have a pretty good offensive line. Like, there's so many teams, even if it's not top 5, top 8, there's so many teams in that 8 to 15 range that I think should be intrigued with Michael Penix. I thought it was a fantastic performance by him the other day, and you hit it on the head when you said it yesterday. This was his CJ Stroud game, and I got a lot of pushback last year when I said that CJ Stroud game against Georgia changed the whole narrative on terms of what people thought his ceiling could be. I think we've seen it. That game has been a foreshadowing of what we've seen in the NFL. If what Michael Penix did the other night against Texas is a foreshadow of what he has in the repertoire, if he can do the things he did and play more off structure, which we know in the NFL is needed, I think the sky is the limit for him. And it was just great to kind of see there. I'm super excited for the game next Monday night. Hopefully he can keep the momentum going, even if Washington can't pull off the upset.
Yeah, let me just jump in here then. I think it's worth expanding on this point, because this is going to be a storyline, a major storyline of draft season. First of all, like we're talking about the CJ Stroud moment. We're talking about the defense. You said suspect secondary, but what we saw, one thing that was on the tape, all season was just Stroud absolutely dealing from a clean pocket, right? Dropping dimes, perfect ball placement. That was what we had seen from CJ Stroud, at Ohio State, right? Like the big question was like, well, what does he do under pressure, right? Like we haven't really seen that. He's got an amazing O-line. He's staying clean. He's staying protected. Of course, he can just, make these throws. That says his arm talent is great, but how does he do that in adversity, right? Well, this game we got to see a bit of that adversity, right? We got to see him creatively move around the pocket. I think there was a couple throws. So, there's the one where he evades pressure. He steps back up and then he kind of darts right and just kind of throws a little sidearm pass, like perfectly placed right over the middle. And then there's this other throw on tape where you've got a free edge rusher coming through, and on his left side, right, like on his throwing arm side, and he just kind of just like flicks it, with this defender in his face, and this ball just sails perfectly over the cornerback right into, I think it was probably Odunze's hands, but one of those receivers just like, right in the perfect position for his receiver to make a play over the back of the defender. And again, it's just like he had to get that ball out early, and then that didn't disrupt the timing of the play, right? Like he adjusted his throw and his trajectory to make the timing of the play work when he had to throw it a beat too early. And so like that's the type of stuff that we're definitely going to see on the Michigan game, because if you saw how Michigan just destroyed Alabama's O-line, we're going to have to see Michael Penix, like we're going to have to see him pull more of these plays out, like the frequency in which we're going to see this test come is going to just be a majority of the game, instead of in highlights where we can kind of say, oh well, now we know he can do it. And so that's what's going to actually be the differentiator, in my opinion, on who can actually win this championship game. Because if Penix and the Washington offense can operate under that stress of that pass rush, under the stress of a defense trying to lock them down and take away what they're good at, like you said, he's a good distributor, then the passing offense will score enough points where they can win. And I don't think CJ McCarthy or Blake Corum could really catch up. And just, the arm talent with Tua, right? Like he had a pass to, I think, the touchdown to Jalen McMillan, where it was, middle of field open, but these safeties were converging really, like it was a tight window and it was closing extremely fast. And Brock Purdy, Tua could not get this ball in there, right? Like you need like a Justin Herbert level arm to be able to rocket the ball in there before the window closes and before a defender gets their fingers on it. And it was just amazing to see him recognize that on the right time and deliver the ball. Your footwork has to be great to be able to get rid of it that moment you need to, not a beat after. It's not like, oh, now I see it, now set my feet, now throw that ball. So he was already ready to like deliver that strike, and he was able to do it with arm talent that isn't that is above average for NFL starters, right? So that's just, there's a lot to like for Michael Penix Jr. and he's showing people, like you said, checking off boxes, a much more diverse skill set than people have been boxing him into as like this sort of, it was who was the Nevada quarterback that came out? Carson Strong, right? Was that I got the right name? Where he was definitely had this rocket arm, this beautiful deep ball, but he was just kind of like a statue in there. He kind of got stuck in there. He just didn't like. Michael Penix offers so much more. And this was kind of something we got excited about him as a prospect, right? But then there's the injuries in Indiana, and like, can it really shine? And we're just seeing that light bulb click on. And just, even though it's going to take us even further down the rabbit hole, my question to you is, everybody got excited. Like there was a lot of questions about the Joe Burrow year, right? Like a 1 year wonder, can you really buy into this, right? And I was trying to wonder, like, if there was so much excitement for Burrow, why can't we be this excited for Penix? I mean, that trajectory is the same. He's taking the program all the way to the championship. And if he is able to win that, what's that difference there? And we talked about a few factors, right? Just off the top of your head, it was kind of like, what was it? It was age, injury history. We talked about that, but like elite wide receivers for Michael Penix, right? But, Burrow had Chase and Jefferson, right? The level of competition against the Pac-12. Well, we just got to see it versus Bama, or versus Texas. It just, we're able to see a lot of what we weren't able to see before in these playoffs. And I think if there's any person who can catapult his draft stock the most, it's not even Jase McCarthy. It's like Michael Penix Jr., who I do think, I think he'll pretty comfortably fit in my top 5 and maybe even top 4 and quarterbacks and top half of first round 1.
Yeah, I mean, I have a hard time right now. We're gonna pivot to the other game momentarily. I have a hard time, and it's most of the year major draft Twitter and the in the know guys have had JJ McCarthy ahead of Michael Penix. I have never had that. I've came on here and said people I respect tremendously have continued to say that they think JJ McCarthy is a round 1 talent. I have said I must be missing something because people who have more inside information than me, more film than me, continue to harp on that is what that's where his draft stock is. That's what the NFL thinks. But I watched these guys play back-to-back games. And now you're going to see them in the same game. But, I watched them play back-to-back games. And to me, I don't see how right now somebody could have J.J. McCarthy ahead of Michael Penix Jr. Is it straight projecting? But what Michael Penix has been asked to do compared to J.J. McCarthy is night and day. It's not even comparable. And one last point about this was his moment. I know it sounds wild, but for his draft stock, if Texas would have found a way to finish off that improbable comeback when I would have been sleeping in my bed, you almost wonder if they lost the game in some unfathomable way at the end, and this was the lasting game of Michael Penix Jr., there would be less criticism. Almost like C.J. Stroud lost that game last year, even though he played unbelievable. And if he would have went to the national championship game and maybe had a so-so game, could it have almost hurt his stock? Could that happen here with Michael Penix Jr.? If he lays a complete dud, if he looks terrible against Michigan's defense, it's almost like if this was his lasting moment. But on the flip side, you just said Joe Burrow. He finds a way to beat Michigan. We might be talking top 8, top 5, top 10. Mm-hmm. Does he somehow push Jayden Daniels down? Does he somehow push Drake May down? I think that's the upside of him finishing this off. The downside is if he has a really bad game, if he looks like he did maybe, I think it was that Arizona State game, he was very shaky, if I remember correctly. If he has a bad game, they get blown out. Could it then start bringing back those concerns that people had? It's going to be a fascinating story. Before we pivot to the other game, the other things that stood out, Quinn Ewers still undecided. I don't think he's going to be in Texas next year. I think the Arch Manning hoopla is picking up too much steam. That Quinn Ewers is either going pro, not sure he's ready for that yet, or he's going to go to the transfer portal. He had 318, a touchdown, 54 yards rushing. He's a very developmental. We've talked about him a lot. He hasn't changed much, I think, from what we thought about him in the summer. I was projecting growth, and more development and refinement, which is why I thought he could have been a round 1 guy. I think he's sitting in there probably as a round 2 guy if he comes out. I think if he goes back with a weaker quarterback class next year, right now, besides Jatavion Sanders, is there any round 1 guys for next year that are getting hype? So I could see Quinn Ewers going back to school, maybe trying either Texas and fight off Arch Manning for another year, or the transfer portal. And then the wide receivers, Rome Odunze, 6 catches, 125. I think Daniel Jeremiah said he has him basically on the same level as Marvin Harrison Jr. I hadn't heard that take. I love Rome Odunze. He's my wide receiver 3 in this class, but that's some lofty praise from Daniel Jeremiah. James Polk, 5 catches, 122 yards and a touchdown. We'll see if he declares. He's only a redshirt sophomore. Jalen McMillan, 5 catches, 58 yards and a touchdown. That whole wide receiver trio, fantastic. I'm pretty sure Odunze is going. I think with to wait and see on the other guys. And then the Texas side of it, 3 interesting prospects as well. Jatavion Sanders, 6 catches, 75 yards. I think he's locked in for tight end 2 in this class. I think the only guy, it's Brock Bowers in his own tier. I think it's Jatavion Sanders in his own tier. before we kind of get a third tier that's a little bit more clustered. AD Mitchell, I think he's going round 2. I was just on with Brandon Lejeune and did a video breaking down AD Mitchell. You guys should check it out over on YouTube. And I like his game, AD Mitchell. He's a guy, I think right now he sits at like number 10 on my wide receiver board. But I think there's like 15 wide receivers going in the top 100. I like AD Mitchell. And then Xavier Worthy, 2 catches, 45 yards, really struggled the other night to create separation. He's a guy I still like, but I think the NFL might be a little lower on him. Concerns about the size, the frame, his ability to play anywhere besides the slot. Tank down. This thing has more physicality to his game than a guy like Xavier Worthy, but we know NFL loves speed. So I think that'll still get Worthy drafted on day 2. Jeff,
yeah, I think Worthy's a good conversation topic because it's not like he had a breakout season that's on the level of, I think, the hype that you'd that meets the level of hype that you'd kind of see if you'd expect to see if you were like following on Twitter or draft Twitter.
We'll see if we get him back. Jeff, are you still with me?
Yeah, I am. Yeah, I think Xavier Worthy.
Yeah, so you're
interesting because I don't think the production that we've seen this year is sort of matching the level of fanfare, that follows them around on like the draft Twitter and the Devy Twitter. And, a lot of like, if you perform early, you're going to be able to carry that with you a long ways. But I don't know that the NFL is necessarily one of those places that it'll carry to. They definitely care if you broke out and produced as a freshman. But, if you didn't really produce lately, then, they'll move on to the new shiny thing that, that is like, AD Mitchell is, was out producing him down the stretch generally. I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but, every time I like look through the game, look through the box score, those are where the highlights are. Those are where the stats are. And, it doesn't mean he's a bad player, but like, are your expectations closer to, say like a Josh Downs for him at the NFL level?
Yeah, I think that's the question. Listen, I think teams are still going to be intrigued with him, but he's got to fly on his 40. He needs to be like 4.35 or below. Like he's got to be a guy that's looked at as a true speed guy. Josh Downs was a really, my love for Josh Downs, a very good refined route runner. That it was a guy that could eat up in the slot, 90 catches. I've never looked at Xavier Worthy and thought refined, great route runner. I've seen a guy that I think could win over the top. He better fly. It better not be 4.44 for Xavier Worthy. Not fast enough. Not at his size and frame. It'll still get him drafted. He'll still go in round 3 or round 4. But I think if he wants to go in round 2, he better be basically one of the fastest wide receivers in the draft. He better be closing in on that 4.30 to 4.35 range. I think that's what's going to take to get him hot again in that circle. Because I think right now AD Mitchell is probably going ahead of him if he declares, right? I think AD Mitchell's another guy, could go back to school, maybe really catapult his draft stock to be a round 1 guy next year. I think that might behoove him, but we'll see about that, whether or not he stays around. But I love his body control and ball skills. Odunze, I already talked about. I love him. Be interesting to see if Polk declares as a redshirt sophomore with a lot of years left. But so many skilled players there that are fun to talk about. But I think Worthy's the most intriguing one because he's been the one that's been in our minds the longest for sure. If we take this over to the other game, not as much to talk about. Michigan wins 27-20. J.J. McCarthy, 221 yards, 3 touchdowns. Jalen Milroe struggles for Alabama, 16 of 23, 116 yards. They had 63 on the ground. They still almost won, even with that poor game from Jalen Milroe. Blake Corum, 83 yards rushing, 35 yards receiving, and a touchdown. Jase McClellan on Alabama's side, 87 yards and 2 touchdowns. And the only receiver that really stood out was Roman Wilson, the senior from Michigan. I think he's going to be one of the more decorated seniors in the NFL draft. And at the Senior Bowl, 4 catches, 73 yards, and a touchdown. Jeff, any thoughts there? I know Blake Corum's one of your guys. If you want to talk about Corum, if you want to touch on Milroe or McCarthy, before we kind of turn this over to a couple other quick hitters to end the show.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of see, in the way the games are and the way the stats are, the strengths and stats on kind of both, the differences of both games, right? You saw, fireworks from the get-go on Washington, Texas, and Michigan, Alabama was a pretty good slog. And I think that's going to make for a really good, finals matchup, between kind of like the strength on one side versus strength on the other between Michigan and Washington. Jalen Milroe is somebody we talked about, right about the time he kind of got benched, and then won the job back. And we've seen tremendous amount of growth, in his game. And I'm really bullish on, on his prospects if he continues down that path. But I think you saw on Michigan that was a tough challenge, but and it's not like the Alabama O-line really gave him any shot, right? The support around him, wasn't there for a great game. But that was kind of one of the moments there that, if he wins that game, that's a signature moment, feather in his cap, monumental leap. And, it's just, we're waiting for him to quote unquote arrive, but I still think that there's a bright future for Milroe. I love how I love how he fought through this year, and I think he's become a much better player. And we've talked to JJ McCarthy. I don't think we have to belabor that point. There'll be a lot of time for that, especially when we after next week. But Blake Corum, I just have to say, like, I think in general, it's one of those ones where he's been my guy. You just watch how he runs. You watch the nuance with which he runs, the movement skills. And I don't care that, he went back to school this year. He beat out Donovan Edwards. I don't know what more you can ask for. Like, we thought this running back class would be stellar. It's turned out to be a little bit lackluster. But like, who would you take over Blake Corum right now in this draft class? Like, I'm struggling to come up with names.
Yeah, I mean, for me, him and Trey Benson have been my 1-2 the whole year. I don't see that changing. Maybe I flip-flop them. I feel like I've kind of flip-flopped them since the summer. I would go Benson, I'd go Corum. So I think that's still, Benson didn't have the year I expected. Corum kind of did what I expected. So maybe that's a determining factor. Maybe I keep Benson there because I think he's built a little bit more to handle maybe a heavier workload at the next level. But I think there's some untapped receiving upside in Blake Corum's game that they just didn't need from him. So I think he could be that. So yeah, I mean, JJ McCarthy, I think we could have that full conversation after next week. Does he declare? Because he could be another guy that says, you know what, this year I come out, maybe I'm the 5th quarterback. I go back to school. Maybe I could be in the running to be the 1st or 2nd or 3rd. Michigan's a loaded team. So I think he's an interesting decision. Similar to Quinn Ewers, I think his stock's probably a little bit higher than Quinn Ewers if we just go from what we hear, the tea leaves and the in-the-know people. So that'll be an interesting conversation for sure. Jalen Milroe, still my favorite besides Jatavion Sanders, who basically has said he's going back. Jalen Milroe would be the one that gets me most excited about Devi college prospect of all the quarterbacks, ahead of guys like Drew Alar and other guys that I just think Milroe's combination, of rushing and passing would be the guy in the Devi landscape of non-draft eligible quarterbacks, not named Jatavion Sanders, who's going back, who I'd be most intrigued with. So let's kind of spin this to, we have had a lot of declarations of guys declaring that they're coming out. Even guys who we almost assumed that were coming out still had that COVID year. So we kind of still had to wait to hear if they were officially coming out. And then more guys have entered the transfer portal. Some have finally found homes. So we'll do it like this. I'm going to run through the declarations. If there's anything that you want to talk about that stands out, let me know. And then after that, we'll do the same thing with the transfer portal, and then we'll get out of here. So in terms of the ones who've declared, Jayden Daniels have made it official, the Heisman Trophy winner. I think he's on the trajectory to be a top 5 pick. I think the question is whether or not he can push Drake May out of the QB2 spot if we assume Caleb Williams is locked in the QB1. I'm not so sure that's definitive. I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about the quarterback landscape at the top of this draft. And as we said, we'll see if Michael Penix can throw his name in the mix if he pulls off the upset. Joe Milton, I feel like he's been in college forever. For a while, it sounded like he was maybe going to use one more year. He officially announced that he's declaring. So Joe Milton out of Tennessee. We just talked about him, running back out of Florida State. Trey Benson, Running back Audric Esteem out of Notre Dame, Kendall Milton out of Georgia, and Braylon Allen out of Wisconsin all made it known that they're entering the 2024 NFL Draft. At the wide receiver position, which is the most loaded, stacked position I've seen in years in terms of a draft, Florida State wide receivers Keon Coleman and Johnny Wilson. I think Keon Coleman's going round 1, top 15, top 20. Johnny Wilson maybe day 2. Brian Thomas Jr. out of LSU. A lot of talk he's going late round 1 to early portion of round 2. Obviously, we're still waiting official word. I think on Malik Neighbors. I couldn't find anything to that he officially, but I'm assuming it's just a formality with him. Troy Franklin out of Oregon, he's declared. I think he could be in the mix like Brian Thomas Jr. as a late 1, early 2. Ladd McConkey out of Georgia, I think he's going day 2. Ricky Purcell out of Florida, I think he's a round 3, round 4 guy. And then obviously we talked about him, Xavier Worthy made it be known as well. And then the tight end position, obviously the premier tight end, Brock Bowers, he declared officially. Jaheim Bell out of Florida State, he made it known. And then also Dio Johnson out of Penn State. I think Bell is probably an early day 3. I think Dio Johnson's going to surprise people. He could be this year's Brenton Strange, Luke Schoonmaker, guys that we never considered as day 2 tight end prospects. I have a feeling Theo Johnson might be that sneaky name this year. He's had a lot of untapped athleticism, I think, for years. He could be a sneaky guy that somewhere maybe on round 3 sneaks in there. So, Jeff, any thoughts on the declarations there? Anything stand out? I don't think there's too many surprises there, but anything you want to touch on there before we end with the transfer stuff?
No, I mean, you summed it up great. I think generally my only worry with Jayden Daniels is like his growth has been immense this year, right? Like, we've seen that Heisman level play, like straight up. He was one of the most electric players in all of college football, and for great reason. And it's hard to envision, how it's easy to envision how exciting that could be on an NFL field. I am a little bit more worried about how directly it does transfer. I think I feel safer about Penix if I'm an NFL team, and I want someone who could come in, like run my offense and, get me wins like CJ Stroud did. Like, I definitely feel more comfortable with Penix. That's not to say that that's the right choice. I think I need to dig a lot more into Jayden Daniels. But, one of the things that I think I'm overcoming myself is the tape that he put on prior to this explosion. And is that going to be held against him? Like, why? What's the reasoning behind this major leap? And I mean, look, we have to give him credit for it. Like, I think he deserves to be in that conversation of a top 3 quarterback in this year. And like, if a team falls in love with him and they have a plan for him, like, that's great. I really won't argue it. But that's kind of like, I just don't know how I feel about that from like a comfort level. Right. And maybe if I take that kind of, analysis down to like the running back position, he's not going to be my RB1. But in the uncertainty of how the NFL draft and landscape unfolds, I think Braylon Allen is probably the safest, running back from like a draft capital perspective. And that's probably a hot take, because if he runs pretty slow, like, we might see his draft stock crater. But I just, I think from what we've seen of him, we've seen those big runs. He's a big physical guy. I just think he's going to be a pretty safe day 2 running back. But, I think when I asked that question about Corum, you said Trey Benson, and, my love for Trey Benson, my heart fluttered a little bit. I was like, oh yeah, he might be right. Trey Benson might be my number 1. But based on the play this year, and the tape this year, I really have to give it to Corum, right? If that's what I'm using, the latest information available to me. But Audric Estime, I think, is a great sleeper, as far as that Notre Dame running back who could really be, again, just one of those guys that kind of leapfrog Braylon Allen as, maybe a surprise, 3rd or 4th running back chosen in the class, maybe even 2nd, depending on how this all shakes out and what teams want. He's a very good player, and we didn't talk enough about him. at the beginning or before the year. I think we talked a lot about him at the beginning of the year when he was the only one producing in college football for the running back position. And then I think we got into the rest of how the college football playoff landscape was going, the rest of the teams and the ups and downs. And so it's a player we should not forget about. And, who I think is better than the amount of hype around the NFL draft would suggest.
Yeah, I think you're spot on there. And listen, the Jayden Daniels thing, I think it's one of those things where he is a late bloomer, whether it was the infrastructure he had at Arizona State, whether, we saw him starting to develop last year, taking the final step this year. I just think the way the NFL, the way people are enamored with Lamar Jackson, Jalen Hurts, Anthony Richardson last year, I just feel like that dual capabilities is going to get Jayden Daniels pushed up, and he's going to get pushed up high. So it's going to be fun quarterback class. I know my team, the Giants, I want them to come away with one of these quarterbacks near the top of the draft there. But it's going to be fun. It's going to be a fun draft cycle with these quarterbacks. I don't think it's locked in stone and Sharpie in terms of the order in which these guys come off the board. I think some teams might see things very differently, and that makes for a fun draft process for sure. Let's spin this over to the last thing of the night, the transfer portal. I talked a lot of transfer stuff on the previous episode about 2 weeks ago before the holidays, but there's been a lot more news since then. A quarterback position, DJ Ulangale, originally Clemson, off to Oregon State, had his best year in a while this past year. I thought maybe he was going to pivot it to the NFL and see if he can go on like round 4. He's going back to the ACC. If Florida State's still there, that's a different story for a different day. But he's going to go to Florida State. I think I have every intention to be the starting quarterback there next year for the Seminoles. Underclassmen news, Dante Moore, the highly regarded recruit who ended up at UCLA, he's transferring to Oregon, so that kind of sets the stage for him to be the heir apparent to Bo Nix. Malik Murphy, who was the backup most of the year at Texas, to Quinn Ewers. In between Quinn and Arch Manning, he's heading to Duke to replace Riley Leonard, who transferred out. At the running back position, Trevor Etienne. Last time I talked about him being in the transfer portal, now it's known that he's headed to Georgia. He'll be a part of that Georgia backfield. That's really intriguing. Jaquavius Marks leaving Mississippi State, very multifaceted running back, great receiver. He's going to USC. I think that's going to be a guy that they use in a lot of different ways. They're going back to the transfer portal. Last year, right, it was Marshawn Lloyd. This year, it's going to be Jaquavius Marks there at the running back position. And at the wide receiver position, Juice Wells headed to Ole Miss. Obviously, he was at South Carolina, and now he's heading to Ole Miss. He would be a guy that if he didn't get hurt, he was going to be a guy that I was in my top 6, top 7 wide receivers. Really intrigued to hope that Juice Wells can come all the way back healthy. Julian Fleming, once upon a time, one of the most highly regarded Devy prospects, heading to UNC to see if he could salvage his career there. Ja'Cory Brooks, leaving Alabama after all the hoopla early in his tenure there, heading to Louisville. Mario Williams, another guy, right? He's been bouncing around, highly regarded, Oklahoma, went to USC. Now he's in the transfer portal. But of all the wide receiver news, the one that's most intriguing, wasn't draft eligible, but was one of the most highly regarded wide receiver prospects for the 2025 NFL draft, Evan Stewart, leaving Texas A&M, to be determined where he ends up. He is a game changer that could be there. And I also forgot to add to my list, your boy Dorian Singer's leaving USC, and he's back in the portal. We'll see if he ends up somewhere where he can get back on the track of being an intriguing prospect as well. So, Jeff, any quick thoughts on the transfer stuff before we get out of here?
Yeah, I mean, you can't ignore this, right? Like we saw what Bo Nix did, moving off to Oregon. Like, this is a really, I don't know. I feel like it's a pretty big gambit. I think a lot of times I see these kind of transfers, and it's hard to get acclimated to a new system, a new school, a new state, like new coach, new quarterback, new team. Like, I don't know. I think that's hard, but like it can really inject life into your game if you were struggling in a situation where, like, no matter how hard you tried, you just can't overcome. And I mean, we see that all the time, and it's great that these players have the opportunity, to choose their own destiny. Whereas, like, you get someone like Bryce Young for example, who is just going to get stuck and ruined in Carolina, and there's nothing you can do about it. So fascinating that, Dante Moore is going to go to Oregon. I have high hopes for that. We've seen Oregon have this high flying offense. Dante Moore is a capable pilot for that, for sure. And then Evan Stewart, I don't know what happened at A&M. I know there's always, A&M is just an interesting college program where, you never really want your favorite, Debbie High School player to sign on there, because it just doesn't seem like the track record's, supporting, amazing development. But, Evan Stewart went there, and I think he's saying, he had such a great start to the year, and I felt like he disappeared, and I don't know why. Like, I don't know what went on. I'm not, blaming him necessarily, but where he lands, who he lands with, you could see something like a Jordan Addison
in the background. Yeah, I think there was definitely some stuff probably going on behind the scenes there that we were just, not, not certain exactly what was going on there. But the whole transfer portal, I know it's wild and crazy and it's easy to miss things, but it's really fascinating. And with the success we've seen of people like Michael Penix Jr. when he goes to a new home, and Jayden Daniels when he goes to a new home, I think it opens up now where guys who maybe would have just declared and went out because they weren't going to go through that sit out a year. I think it's good for college football. I know some people don't like it because it's almost like free agency every year and it's wild, the wild, wild west out there. But I think for the players and their futures and their careers and developing for the NFL game, this is enabling people to get second or third opportunities that maybe would have had no chance to ever find their way, with any draft capital to be a relevant person in the NFL. And now we're seeing Michael Penix, we're seeing Jayden Daniels. Maybe next year it's DJ Ulangale who pushes his way into day two, or pick a name, right? That maybe we thought it was over
in the
for
past.
that.
Yeah, in the past, Jordan Addison, right? We knew he was going to do well, but then he goes, to USC with Caleb Williams and, becomes a first round pick too, right? So again, that's the type of, Evan Stewart could be, that player who catapults himself into a top 10 draft pick because he hitches himself, to a prolific passer.
Yeah, and we could be having this conversation next year about Quinn Ewers, that he went somewhere, he found the right place for him, and next year he's QB1 or QB2. I don't think that's out of the realm of possibility. He's got all the natural traits. It's about getting him into a scheme where he shows more consistency and refinement, and if he can get there in a different home, who knows? He might be the guy we're talking about as one of the top, picks in the 2025 NFL draft. So I think it's really added this extra layer and element that's really intriguing. But Jeff, it was so fun having you back across the way. Looking forward to hopefully next week we can get a time locked in where we can do it again, talk about the national championship game, do a big recap of the NFL season in terms of the rookies, stock up, stock down, full landscape of the rookies, because it was a fantastic rookie class at all the positions for fantasy, quarterback, wide receiver, running back and tight end, all, a lot to talk about in the rookies, in a concluding, NFL rookie report for this season as well. If you're enjoying the content, please over to the website, SS Football, fastest and easiest way to get there. Check out the premium content tab for $9.99. You get all our stuff. It's draft season now. You would love this content. You get the scouting notebook, almost 100 detailed scouting reports in there, strengths, functional areas, developmental areas, how they win, NFL role, fantasy spin. That will be updated when all the declarations are done, and I will separate the tabs. So you have tabs with just the guys who declared, guys who are going back, separated on that. You get the rankings notebook. It has all our different rankings. That too, I will also split it up to just the guys that declare once that becomes finalized. And then you get the draft projections notebook in April. Tabs for every position, offense and defense, snapshot of how they win, ranked in an order of how we expect them to come off the board from everything we're hearing, reading, and seeing as well. Jeff, any final parting shots before we get out of here?
No, I can't wait to join next week. Toddler willing, if I get any sleep. You'll see me back on camera.
Absolutely. So guys, I know it's been a couple weeks. We will be much more regular and much more consistent. I was getting some work done in my house, the holidays. It was kind of a crazy, hectic time. But now it's draft season, national championship next week. We'll be here covering it wire to wire. So on behalf of Jeff, on behalf of our sound tech engineer, David Nicano, and myself, thank you for joining us. And we look forward next time taking you from Saturday to Sunday.